The China-Indonesian economic relationship has stood out as one of the most important bilateral partnerships in the entire Asia-Pacific region. This is due to China's stance as an active investor, which brought in billions of dollars worth of loans and investments and paved the way for many economic miracles and infrastructures to be realized. However, there is just one problem. Is China really a significant investor in Indonesia? Since, after all, China is not the only investor in the archipelago nation. There are, in fact, a lot of nations anticipating the overall growth of Indonesia, other nations in East Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. Well, let us first see what the data from Statistics Indonesia can show us. Starting in 2019 to 2021, the total project investment of China sums to about $7 billion US, a massive figure right there in the billions. However, the truth of the matter is, it is just one part of the entire investment pie. The collective investment that went into Indonesia in that time frame was over $113 billion. This simply means that even though China's investment totals about $7 billion, it is just small. Furthermore, when we compare China's investment to Singapore or Japan, we will find out that China's presence would be far less than what most people think. The same data from Statistics Indonesia has shown that the island nation of Singapore has invested over $29 billion, whereas Japan had invested nearly $17 billion. Their investment in Indonesia far overshadows that of China. So does this mean, despite all the political and media noise, China is not really that big of an investor? Better yet, does Indonesia even need China? If Indonesia can find better investors who are more willing to place larger investments, why do they even bother turning to China? A country that is plagued with notorious political agendas, as claimed by many Western governments and intelligence agencies. Well, to understand whether China's role is really needed in Indonesia, let us discuss the hidden aspects that are not included in investments. This is because investments are just one part of the many other factors that China can dive into economic building. For instance, China can invest through the use of debt, joint ventures between Chinese companies and Indonesian companies, and a long list of other factors that investments are missing out on. And that is what we are going to discuss today, and only then will we be able to understand whether China really is needed in Indonesia. Arguably, the single reason why China is so famous in the entire international landscape is due to one word: debt. The debt diplomacy of China, in other words, has become synonymous with their foreign policy. Hence why, if we are going to understand China's role in Indonesia, we will need to understand their role in giving loans to the country and also investments. Debt, however, before we dive into it, is a good instrument. The only issue with debt is if it is mismanaged. However, if it is properly governed, it will lead many nations, and even corporations, to construct and buy assets that they initially could not afford. In simpler terms, debt is good and necessary and should be regarded as a way for nations to build themselves. Now, there are many debts. Different debts happen from China to Indonesia. The most regarded one, however, is through a country's own external debt. According to Bank Indonesia, the latest data of the country's external debt sums up to about $38 billion owed to both mainland China and Hong Kong. Now, this total data should still be subjected to many factors, because total external debt, as reported by one's country, consists of both government and private debt. Meaning, a corporation from Indonesia could borrow from either China or Hong Kong, which will add up to the country's overall external debt. However, due to a lack of open data as to who really owns this debt, many third parties have claimed that this private debt owed to China is still under the government. In simpler terms, the larger part of the $38 billion debt is from the government. It is claimed that these debts are tied down to the government's own state-owned enterprises, or SOEs for short. State-owned enterprises are simply companies that are either owned or controlled by the Indonesian government themselves. For instance, the high-speed railway known as Jakarta-Bandung HSR is constructed by a joint venture between 4 state-owned enterprises of Indonesia and China Railway International Corporation, resulting in the creation of PT Karya Kereta Cepat Indonesia China. The funds procured for this project were reported to be 75% coming from the China Development Bank, whereas the remaining 25% was from the SOEs. The 75% was loaned directly from that Chinese bank and will be paid down by the PT Kereta Cepat Consortium. The consortium, likewise, is jointly owned by Indonesia and China, where 60% is owned by the state and 40% by China. Through this type of initiative, we are likely to see a debt link to the state's government, and the funds repaid down would most be taken from the high-speed railways operations. But the thing is, this is not the only program out there. A lot more is reported by a US-based research company. The public database known as Data, published by William and Mary, has reported that this so-called hidden public debt amounts to over $17.28 billion tied to state-owned enterprises. And external debt owed by the government and state-owned enterprises is not the only factor we need to look at, since there is also a term known as financial aid. The same public data has shown that from 2000 to 2017, the financial aid committed from China amounted to over $34.9 billion. Now, this might suggest that foreign investment from China may be small, but the total debt lent and financial aid from China is huge. That is true. Chinese debts overshadow their total investments, especially within Indonesia's own SOEs. Therefore, it should conclude with the matter that a considerable number of Indonesian infrastructure and overall economic growth was, thankfully, due to China. But we are still missing one major part of its debt. Chinese debt is not the only debt that Indonesia has. The total external debt that Indonesia owes from a crediting country is over $208 billion. Meaning China and Hong Kong's debt owed by Indonesia is just 18% of the total debt to any country. The largest lender to Indonesia is even Singapore, which lent $59 billion. But do take note that the same data takes a look at both the public and private debt, because if we take a look at the debts owed only from the government side, we will actually see that the largest crediting country to the Indonesian government is actually Japan with over $8.6 billion, whereas China and Hong Kong with less than $2 billion. In simpler terms, Chinese and Hong Kong loans in both categories, government and private debt, are overshadowed by both Japan and Singapore, and likewise, they are just a small part of the entire debt pie. Many can now argue that they are still insignificant to Indonesia. Yes, right now that is. The single reason why China is a world-famous high-profile foreign country is not because of its debts. No, none of those. Much of what really makes China where it is today is mainly because of the country's future potential and pledges. You see, this is where things become more interesting. This is because China's economy has been steadily increasing every single year. Their importance to the world has become more crucial. Therefore, their role in international affairs would one day far outweigh what the current superpower holds, which is the United States. We can see this through their investment pledges, promises that they wish to do for Indonesia not today, not even in the coming years, but in the coming decades. This is why it is important, because soon China's money will keep growing, and it will impact Indonesia a lot. In fact, in 2019, Beijing pledged a whopping $91 billion from Belt and Road Initiative funds to Jakarta. This high-speed railway from Jakarta to Bandung, in other words, is just one part of the more investment pledges that Beijing will make. They have even invested over $3 billion into Indonesia's own sovereign wealth fund known as INA, which will further help economic and infrastructural development in the archipelago country. The reason, however, why China sees a huge potential in Indonesia is that the archipelago nation holds a massive amount of natural resources. For China to continuously be the factory of the world, they will be needing a lot of raw materials to ensure their title as one still lives on, as it is the largest benefactor to China's own economic growth. Furthermore, China's own domestic market is huge, and for them to cater to every single person's demand, they will need a lot of materials to keep the supply going. And one of the largest industries that we have seen so far is the electric vehicle industry. China's own private corporations have massively stepped up and invested billions of dollars into the coming change in the automotive industry. But anyway, do you think Indonesia really needs China, or does China need Indonesia? Thanks for watching.